Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Electricity Association's Conversation webinar series. The Canadian Electricity Association is the voice of the electricity industry in Canada. My name is Dave McHenry, Senior Fellow with the CEA, and I'm pleased to be your host for today's webinar. The Conversation series features presentations from CEA's corporate partners, and the series highlights a variety of Canadian and international solutions to current and future challenges faced by the industry. Working with CEA's corporate partners, these webinars have been developed to be of specific interest to those working in the electric utility space from generation through to the customer. For a list of upcoming sessions, check out CEA's website at electricity.ca. These webinars allow a broad national audience to participate at low or no cost without the need to travel or invest a lot of time. We're broadcasting to over 35 locations today across Canada from Ottawa. And before we get started, here are a few housekeeping items. Our session is scheduled to run between 1 and 2 p.m. Eastern. Questions can be asked, and we would encourage you to do so as they come to mind by typing them into the chat function on the panel on your screen, and we will ask those questions to our presenters at the end of the presentation. We'd ask that you please set your devices to mute, and a brief survey will be sent to webinar participants following this session today. And we're very much appreciating your candid feedback and are interested in any topics that you would like to have included in the conversation series. Please keep an eye out for future webinars and events through CEA's monthly newsletter, Current Affairs. With over 6,000 subscribers, Current Affairs, much like a national newspaper, is the place to go for a Canadian perspective on industry news as we connect the national value chain from generation right through to customer. If you would like to receive Current Affairs, you can subscribe to this free publication via CEA's website, electricity.ca. Today's topic is developments, experience, and best practice from performance-based regulation. SNC Electric's regulatory team will share key highlights from performance-based regulation regimes internationally, including their experience from working on the implementation of Revenue Through Incentives, Innovation and Outputs, or RIIO, price controls framework in the UK, as well as lessons learned. This webinar will provide a look at current developments and regulatory arrangements being implemented in the UK, Australia, and New York, and will provide insights on effective processes for developing and implementing PBR in other regions. Our presenters today include Chris Watts, who's Director of SNC's Regulatory Affairs team. Chris will be presenting to us from England today. Brian Levite, who is Regulatory Affairs Director with SNC, and Brian will be presenting from New York in the United States. And finally, Grant McEachran, Regulatory Affairs Director with SNC, will be also presenting to us from Scotland. So today, very much an international view. At this point, I would like to call upon Chris Watts to please come on camera, and Chris will turn the webinar over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dave, and thank you all for joining us. It's a pleasure for us to speak to you all today as part of this webinar on performance-based regulation. As part of this, we plan to share our perspective on developing and implementing future regulation and developments in PBR internationally. We've got 3 different people covering 3 different regions. Firstly, I'll present on RIIO-2 in Britain, one of the leaders in performance-based regulation, and then Brian will discuss the US, which is a much more complex picture with leaders and laggards. And Grant will discuss Australia and New Zealand, which are also great case studies because of the range of approaches they're using. Grant's going to also pull our learning together and introduce you to some of the work we're doing on best practice and a process to support regulatory change. Oops. First, as an introduction to S&C, S&C has a unique perspective on market and regulatory developments, as we have a presence in many countries internationally. We have a good understanding of the energy system transition through our involvement in work in the UK on the evolution of distribution system operator roles, and also through our work on non-wires alternatives in North America. We have extensive regulatory and policy experience from working for the British energy regulator Ofgem in the past, and also currently providing them some consulting support as part of the evolution of the second iteration of RIIO. And we're also drawing on our kind of extensive past regulatory experience and knowledge. We consider that each step in the regulatory journey in terms of performance-based regulation and new utility roles brings regulators, utilities, and customers closer together. We're going to be discussing three aspects of this. Firstly, what we see as key stages in implementing future regulation. We'll then talk about our international kind of experience, developments in PBR in different regions. And finally, we're going to finish off by identifying best practice and discussing our process to implement regulatory change. But first, I'll hand you over to Brian to talk about key steps in implementing future regulation.
Thanks a lot, Chris. So, and thank you to everyone on the webinar for having us here today. We're going to talk about implementing future regulation, sort of what is the glide path. Right now, regulators are dealing with three responsibilities that can be done in concert or they can create tension. Facilitating lower costs can encourage innovation. It could also stymie it. Innovation can create benefits for sector transformation, or it can distract from that goal. And of course, sector transformation may create cost savings, but at least some of the aspects of this transformation are going to cost real money. The trick is getting these three responsibilities happening in concert with each other so that each one supports the next. So I'd like to briefly walk through the evolving methods regulators are using to achieve this balance. So right now, we're typically in most provinces in Canada, we're using cost of service regulation. It's designed to ensure that utilities can recover their costs and make a profit on their investments while keeping this in balance with customer interests. The cost of service approach has two real problems. First, it keeps utility profits tied to infrastructure investments, as opposed to improving performance outcomes for customers. Those two aren't always the same thing. While utilities and regulators strive to improve performance, utilities can't really make more money by doing an excellent job in various areas of performance by extending the services they provide to customers. The second problem is the cost of service regulatory approach tends to undervalue new technologies, such as advanced controls and distributed energy resources. Utilities know they can get a rate of return approval on traditional technologies, but proving the long-term value of new technologies is more difficult. So the solutions are often not leveraged to the extent they probably should be. So if our goal is to have a system optimized to deliver the best possible service while taking advantage of new and innovative solutions, cost of service regulation really isn't designed to get us there today. So a next step would be adaptive rate making. Provinces are looking to ameliorate the situation, the problems of cost of service by using targeted regulatory changes to engender grid transformation. We typically call this adaptive rate making. This could include narrowly tailored and performance-based incentives, specific incentives or penalties associated with performance in a particular area. So right now, these are typically focused on operations, maintenance costs. Alberta and Ontario are good examples of this approach. Alternative rate making could also include mechanisms to compel or incentivize the use of non-wires alternatives. Measures aimed at deferring, mitigating, or eliminating the need for traditional wires investments in utility transmission and distribution grids. When we go a step further and we think, okay, adaptive rate making has worked well, or we want to go right into a more aggressive approach, we get into performance-based regulation. So where adaptive rate making is successful, it can be applied more broadly, and we call this performance-based regulation. So PBR, as we call it, alters the profit incentive for utilities away from capital investments toward meeting performance objectives and improved efficiency. The metrics used could cover anything, but typically include things like reliability, customer satisfaction, safety, carbon footprint reduction, and fostering transportation electrification. Now, PBR can get a little tricky because it can alter the traditional utility regulator compact that exists, where utilities are guaranteed a profit on their investments. Not every utility is keen to bet their bottom line on their ability to meet new targets. PBR also requires regulators to start picking winners and losers when it comes to certain outcomes and goals. Does society prioritize a clean grid or a reliable one? Does it want low rates or an evolution to a more advanced grid? These are questions being discussed by legislators and regulators, while utilities and interest groups lobby for the answers they want. The keys to successful PBR seem to be engaging utilities in a broad range of stakeholders early, so they can have input into the targeted outcomes, which metrics to measure, and what's feasible in each. Also making performance metrics and incentives crystal clear to avoid confusion. Avoiding having too many metrics because that's going to dilute the impact of each one. And finally, understanding that PBR is iterative. It requires feedback and changes in future periods. You're going to hear more about these themes later as we get into our country updates. But first, I just want to talk about what we kind of see as the final stage of modern electricity regulation, which is the distribution systems operator model. This is really a shift in the role that utilities play in the energy market. So right now, we've got two competing pressures. First, utilities are being expected to deliver increasingly consistent system reliability and expand the kinds of generation and loads the distribution grid can handle. At the same time, distributed energy resources, demand-side management, and ancillary services are giving third parties greater opportunities to engage market around energy solutions. The DSO is asked to manage the grid, but also operate a platform by which these third parties are able to exchange energy services directly with each other. Most importantly, this model is set up so that providing the service is how the utility makes money, as opposed to just being an additional requirement or set of requirements tacked on to a cost of service model. There are challenges in transitioning to a DSO model. The first and most obvious is enhancing the regulatory compact, so utilities are able to earn money from their new roles as a DSO, and it doesn't become like an unfunded mandate. PBR can be a healthy way to shift that focus over time and smooth the transition. The second challenge is ensuring utilities have the infrastructure and technical capability to play this role. Forward-looking integrated resource plans and adaptive rate making really help lay the ground for this. Finally, the DSO model requires a robust market of third-party solution providers to bring generation, energy storage, and demand response to the table. And utilities are going to play a key role in facilitating the development of these markets. An established non-wires alternative program, for example, is going to help the market grow to the point that it can scale up to meet the needs in a new DSO scenario. So we talked about the ways that the electricity models are evolving. As Chris said, we now want to share examples of how this is going on around the world. So Chris is going to start by sharing the experiences in Great Britain.
Thanks very much, Brian. Yeah, so as Brian's saying, we're now going to move on to looking at kind of a range of jurisdictions and the experiences there, starting with the RIIO model in Great Britain. I mean, it's worth noting that we're currently really at a key stage in the rate setting process for the second iteration of RIIO in Britain. The draft decisions for the rate cases have just been published for electricity transmission, and also gas transmission and distribution, and these are due to be finalised at the end of the year. Ofgem has also just published its sector methodology for RIIO-2 in electricity distribution, and again, these are due to be finalised in December this year. And in the summer next year, the electricity distribution companies are going to be submitting their initial draft rate filings to Ofgem. In the discussions we're seeing in relation to each of these, there's a strong sense in which the urgency of moves towards a low carbon energy system are increasing. And as part of this, there's a strong focus on the British government's net zero carbon emissions target for 2050 and the Scottish government's equivalent target, which is set earlier for 2045. In RIIO-2, the involvement of stakeholder and customer groups is being stepped up considerably, really recognising that a much broader range of stakeholders wish to get involved with the extensive kind of penetration of DERs, the move towards electrification of heat and transport. Each of the electricity transmission and distribution companies have put in place customer engagement groups, and these really have several roles, partly to challenge the utilities draft rate filings, also to verify that stakeholder input has properly been taken into account, and also to provide their inputs and suggestions in terms of how the rate filings can be improved before they're even submitted to Ofgem. The utilities themselves are using quite a broad range of approaches to engage with customers and wider stakeholders. And these include methods such as workshops, detailed focus groups, in-depth interviews, and also testing out key elements of their plans with stakeholders and seeing whether they need to be refined. One of the innovations in RIIO-2 is also now that Ofgem has its own challenge group, and that really has a dual role, partly to challenge the utilities filings, but also to provide a challenge to Ofgem itself in terms of policy development. And many aspects of both the draft decisions for RIIO-2 and the RIIO-ED1 sector methodology are really focusing on net zero and grid modernisation. In this context, it's worth highlighting that there's been very rapid growth in distributed generation in the UK over the last 15 years, from hardly any distributed generation being connected to the network 15 years ago to nearly 30% of total British generation capacity now being connected to the distribution networks. And we expect this to continue with a broad consensus in the UK on the need for a green recovery. We're also expecting to see a rapid shift towards electric vehicles, with up to 12 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030. And more than 23 million homes will need low carbon heating to meet the net zero emissions targets. Ofgem acknowledges collectively that these factors are likely to lead to a significant increase in demand. And as a result of that, there are changing network needs. Both the utilities and Ofgem recognise the need for key enabling investments to support the energy system transition. And these include areas such as investment in greater visibility of the medium and low voltage networks, investment in advanced protection and controls, and also investment in platforms for non-wires alternatives. The RIIO-2 period is really going to be the period where distribution utilities start to take on major distribution system operator roles. And Ofgem has really kind of recognised this and is looking to put in place new requirements and new incentives around the distribution system operator capabilities. This includes a proposed new requirement for network companies to use non-wires alternatives where it's more efficient to use them than traditional alternatives. There's also a continued focus on maintaining and improving world-class reliability. Ofgem's planning to retain the interruption incentives and is noting that they may need to increase given the importance of reliability in the smart energy system. As part of this, they're intending to place more focus on momentaries and are proposing a minimum standard in this area. They're also recognising the need for strategic investment, and this really means kind of looking out at network requirements over a longer time horizon out to 2050, rather than the continued incremental approach to investment that's been done in the past. However, it's also recognised that there are inherent risks around this because of the uncertainty of timing of the need for investment. As a result of this, Ofgem is putting in place a new framework for strategic investment, which is making extensive use of incentives and uncertainty mechanisms. For investment where there's strong justification and clarity of timing, baseline funding will be allowed. But this baseline funding will be adjusted using a new net zero adjustment mechanism for major strategic investments. And examples that have already been put forward for these types of investment include a major motorway electric vehicle charging network, and also a major high voltage DC project off the east coast of England to connect offshore wind. Ofgem's also maintaining the focus on innovation funding and targeting this more at the energy system transition. They're proposing over 630 million in new innovation funding for the RIIO-2 period. And finally, Ofgem is retaining a shared savings incentive for total expenditure to maintain the incentives to drive efficient costs. However, it's reducing the strength of those incentives. And it's worth noting that the first three of these are really targeted at net zero and uncertainty around the resulting patterns of demand and generation. The final mechanism focused on total expenditure really looks more broadly at this, but is also a kind of key factor in driving efficiency of delivery of the low carbon transition. So I'll now hand you back over to Brian at this stage.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the United States. Now, obviously, the US has a pretty different regulatory environment for every state and territory. It would be difficult to get into specifics around every single one of their experiences. In general, we tend to see a few states as leaders and a few states wanting to make as little change as possible for as long as possible. The bulk of states, though, are what I call wait and see states. They're basically tracking the experiences of more progressive states and incorporating what they see working and avoiding what they see not working or think that won't work for them. So today I wanted to highlight some trends that we see in either progressive states or filtering into the wait and see states. Those are basically clean energy targets, electric vehicle infrastructure, performance regulation, and clarity around DER and microgrids. So a great example of a policy well into the wait and see states is renewable portfolio standards. 34 states now have these standards in place, but that's old news. What's more recent is the fact that many of these states have been updating their targets to address the fact that the state is either ahead of their goals or that market and technologies have made much more ambitious goals possible. Enough progress has been made, in fact, that 13 states and more than 200 cities have committed to 100% clean energy by some date, usually between 2040 and 2050. While many of these targets don't really have binding teeth behind them right now, we believe that the economic recovery efforts after COVID are going to lean heavily into spurring investments into a cleaner, more cost-effective energy system. Next is a strong focus on electric vehicle infrastructure. Regulators in the US are working hard to remove barriers for this emerging market. While residential use of EVs is growing, the tip of the spear here is definitely going to be fleet vehicles. Companies like IKEA, Lyft, Unilever, they've all joined this EV100 initiative, pledging to move to 100% electric fleet. Other firms such as DHL, Amazon, and AT&T have committed to accelerating their transition to electric fleet vehicles. Amazon has ordered 100,000 electric delivery vans, and the US Postal Service is planning for its next generation of mail truck to be all electric, an order that's expected to start at about 200,000 trucks. Industry experts expect this centralized off-peak charging to be both a potential opportunity and a challenge for utilities. In June, California adopted the Advanced Clean Truck Regulation, requiring manufacturers of commercial vehicles to start selling electric trucks in 2024 and to sell only electric trucks in California by 2045. So trucks account for about 70% of vehicle air pollution in the state, despite numbering only 2 million of the roughly 30 million registered vehicles. The California Air Resources Board claims that this first of its kind rule will actually lower related premature deaths by 1,000 per year. In July, New York announced a package of clean transportation initiatives titled the EV Make Ready program. Most of the funding is going to be directed to utilities for the deployment of EV fast charging stations to alleviate range anxiety and accelerate the EV market. There will also be additional support for fleet transition in the form of innovation prizes aimed at specific goals like environmental justice. In June, the governor of Florida signed a law directing the Public Service Commission to develop a plan for EV infrastructure in the state. That plan is expected to come next year. These efforts are joined by similar work in Colorado, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and when we're at the NARUC conference, the US version of CAMPIT, we hear a lot of focus on EV infrastructure. So it's something that regulators in the US are clearly taking seriously. Now, talking about performance-based regulation. Much like Ontario, several US states have looked into how performance-based regulation can help direct their utility investments and remuneration. There really isn't a solid trend here, as states are coming to very different decisions around whether this is needed and what form it should take. New York and Hawaii have embraced a robust version of PBR, while states like California, Illinois, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island have implemented a more narrowly tailored approach. Nevada is continuing to develop its alternative rate making this summer, and Colorado is expected to implement its approach to PBR in 2021. We also, of late, we believe that Maine is likely to pass a PBR bill in their next legislative session. So far, US PBR schemes have avoided prescriptive mandates and have instead allowed utilities to propose measures and benefits in several areas of performance focus that have been identified by the state. It's still too early to garner too many lessons learned about what's working well and what's not, but it's something that we're closely following. Finally, I just want to talk for a minute about distributed energy resources and microgrids. A handful of states, especially those with a strong focus on energy resilience, are working to spur their microgrid and distributed energy markets by creating more clarity around the ownership and operational models that are okay to use. Last year, the California Public Utility Commission began implementing a law directing the creation of regulations, standards, and guidelines around who can own microgrids and how they're regulated. In June, the CPUC ordered large investor-owned utilities to engage in multiple planning exercises to accelerate the deployment of microgrids within their service areas. The commission approved plans by Pacific Gas and Electric and San Diego Gas and Electric to support microgrid adoption. In fact, PG&E plans to have 73 microgrids operational by the end of 2020. I don't think they will, but that's their plan. Hawaii is currently implementing a law passed in July 2019, directing the establishment of a microgrid services tariff to encourage more microgrid development on the island. The goal, like California, is to create clarity around ownership and tariff models to spur development in these systems. Florida has actually approved a community solar program. In Florida Power and Light's Solar Together program, customers can voluntarily pay more on their electricity bills to finance some solar projects and actually receive credits from the expected results, enabling them to receive a payback of about 7 years. Duke Energy is expected to soon submit its plan for a similar program, Duke Energy Connect. So in all of these things that are happening in US states, we're seeing a push towards greater clarity, a push towards more adaptive and responsive regulatory models. But similar things are happening in Australia and New Zealand. And now my colleague Grant McEachran is going to talk to us a little bit about those locations.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. And good afternoon, everyone. Well, so far we've heard today a bit about regulation in the United States and in Great Britain, but it's also been an absolutely key year for regulation in both Australia and in New Zealand. And the reason I say that is, it's the point at which the Australian Energy Regulator has passed the midpoint in its rate setting processes, with only Victoria now still to go in 2021. And in New Zealand, the Commerce Commission completed its reviews for 17 electricity distribution businesses. Now, in doing so, we can see a number of key themes starting to emerge. In particular, grid modernisation is at the fore. Both regulators are grappling with ways of encouraging it in the States and making sure that it can develop effectively. Reliability is also a key theme, and in fact, the two are interrelated because they're looking at the extent to which a reliable network, including in the short term, is in place to ensure the success of the energy transition. And thirdly, affordability remains a key issue. The issue is that consumers should get good value for their money. So looking at how we're getting this messaging and looking what impact it's having, a key issue to look at is stakeholder engagement. Now, traditionally, stakeholder engagement was looked very much as a narrower focus, the relationship between a regulator and the companies. And it was done in very narrow ways as well. So traditionally, you had things such as consultations and workshops were the key tools for engaging with parties. But that is changing and changing significantly. And the reason being that with the growth in different types of energy, with the energy transition, we're seeing a lot of other parties entering the market, interested in having their views heard as part of these processes. And one issue or one approach I do want to draw your attention to is this new reg process, which is a particular process being trialled by one distribution business, so by AusNet Services, in the state of Victoria in Australia. And the reason I think it's important to highlight is at the heart of that process is a customer forum. Now, this is the idea that bringing a group of well-educated, insightful individuals right into the heart of the process, negotiating the package with the company in advance of it going to the regulator, creates a completely different interaction, a completely different dynamic between parties. And as an approach that's resulted here so far in some potentially 5 million savings or 500 million savings to consumers, has resulted in some brand new customer initiatives being proposed, and has also resulted in some specific proposals in relation to reliability. So it's a brand new way to kind of take forward the interaction with stakeholders. And one area this is particularly relevant for is grid modernisation. Now, the reason it's key for grid modernisation is, I say, you're getting a whole range of different parties engaged in the debate. And when we look at grid modernisation, we see that in Australia and in New Zealand, they're grappling with many of the same issues. They recognise the importance of DER and that the pace of its development will only increase over time. They recognise that tied to that is the need for companies to be able to invest in their networks. And they recognise, as I mentioned before, that reliability will also be key to its success. Now, the way it ultimately develops will vary from location to location. Indeed, we can see that even within Australia. In Queensland, there's a much greater focus on solar. Now, that's due to some historic factors, but it's really driving the state and the state government to focus on that as their kind of primary objective. You see something slightly different happening in New South Wales, where there's more of a focus on electric vehicles, particularly in Sydney. And in the Northern Territories, you see a focus on the impact it will have on remote communities and starting to look at microgrids and their potential role. But in addition to that, there are also things that are crucially different as well, and it can be due to state or territorial policies, but can also actually be due to the drivers of the regulator themselves. so what the regulator's seeking to achieve. But regardless of any differences, the one thing that is really stark and is important to highlight is that the position that's being taken by regulators in terms of how they adapt and the mechanisms they put in place to encourage developments are actually fairly consistent. And this takes us to the issue of incentivization. And when we're looking at incentivization, we're looking at a number of different mechanisms that have been put in place. The first one I wanted to highlight goes to the heart of the affordability debate, and that is sharing cost efficiencies. So the idea that if companies can make genuine efficiencies in their decisions, their investment decisions, they get to keep some of those, and indeed they share some with their customers. Now, there's different ways of doing that, as Chris has already demonstrated in Great Britain. You can have a total expenditure approach, but also you can actually separate out operating and capital expenditure, as they are still doing in Australia. The second one I wanted to highlight is in relation to reliability, a key, absolutely key theme. The issue here being, as we said before, if you really want to drive the energy transition, you need a reliable network behind it. And incentives are actually well established in Australia and New Zealand. The ones in New Zealand are actually in many ways quite similar to Great Britain, focusing on asset health and encouraging investment at the right time by the companies. The ones in Australia have gone further, and further in particular in two areas. One, they recognise that there's differences between how customers value reliability. It can differ between residential customers and business customers. It can differ between urban areas and rural areas, and that's built into the incentive mechanisms. The second difference is in relation to short or momentary interruptions, which are specifically incentivised in the state of Victoria. Now, this is a development that they're starting to look at in Great Britain, has been signalled in RIIO2, and they're starting to look at, the Commerce Commission are starting to look at in New Zealand. So it's a watch this space, but certainly an area that is developing in regulation. And the final one I would highlight is innovation incentives. Now, nothing startlingly new here, but what is different is whereas they've had this demand management allowance in Australia for quite a period of time, it's the way it's being used that's changing. The focus on the different types of technology that are coming forward for its use and the power that lies behind the incentive itself. In New Zealand, interestingly, they have brought in a targeted innovation allowance for the first time in the recent rate setting process, and it is specifically targeted at DER. So it's a recognition of the importance of that area and the need to focus on it through regulation. So clearly, the latter is directly related to DER. But the point I want to make with this slide is that the others are also crucially related. And you can't look at incentives in isolation. It's the package that matters. The package is what drives behaviour, and that is what's key for regulators. So look, we've heard today now about a number of different jurisdictions, and we've heard about how they are taking their development of their arrangements forward and grappling with a number of challenges, not least so grid modernisation and how to do so in a way that is affordable, but also provides good quality of service. But having said that, SNC have not just looked at the countries we've discussed today, we've also been looking more widely at other developments in parts of Europe, we've looked in parts of Asia, we've looked in the Middle East as well. And a number of key themes are emerging through that process. So what we've done is we've pulled together a regulatory paper that looks at the overall approaches that are being used and looks at providing a best practice guide for regulation in these times. Now, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but a couple of aspects I wanted to note is that the way we've approached it is to develop a process to support change over time. So the idea that you need a solid foundation in regulation in which you can build on. Having done that, the second aspect is we've identified a number of key stages that regulators have to work through. Now, in essence, there are 6 of these. They are not set in stone, and that leads us to the third point, that actually it is absolutely critical to recognise that no two jurisdictions are identical. All are different in some way, and therefore it's important to recognise that one size does not fit all. Now, as I said, I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but I'm just going to very quickly cover 3 key themes. The first one, it's important to keep it simple. Now, this means focusing down on the real key priorities in your jurisdiction. What do you want to achieve and when? And also the approach to achieve it, keeping the bureaucracy to a minimum. Now, why is that important? Well, we've seen in a number of jurisdictions that complexity can actually drive you in the wrong direction. It can undermine confidence in the arrangements, and it can lead to perverse outcomes. We've seen this in Great Britain, and one example here is when they introduced fast tracking in RIIO-1. This was a process of moving quickly through the price control process and ending rate setting early for some companies. But it was overly complicated, it was difficult to manage, and it led to potentially some companies being rewarded too much, so it was removed. The second example is the number of performance metrics, and one thing we've seen done very well in both Hawaii and Massachusetts is filtering down those metrics to concentrate on some real key areas that really matter to customers and really matter in terms of the energy transition. And thirdly, have focused reporting. Now, this was an obvious example from Denmark. They cut down the reporting requirements to companies, so it made it easier for the companies to focus on their submission, made it easier for the regulator in assessing it, and made it easier for stakeholders to understand what actually was being sought, what they were seeking to achieve. The second one, which I've talked about a number of times today, is stakeholder engagement. You need to fully engage stakeholders. This means going beyond traditional approaches, it means trying different things, and it means actually reaching out to a different group of respondents. Now, why is that important? Well, as we said before, we're in a different world now. Different parties have a vested interest in the outcome, and they have good ideas about how you can solve the problems. Where's best practice being seen? Well, we can see it in Great Britain and Australia, as we mentioned already today, in terms of the use of working groups and now more evolved challenge groups. We can see it in Australia also through a very specific regulatory investment test they have, which is a mechanism for growth expenditure above 6 million. And the idea being it's a very targeted mechanism, clearly set out and regulated or overseen by the regulator. And finally, we can see it in New York in the REV process in a very clear multi-stage process for engaging customers. It's not a one-shot game. By building in over stages, you get better engagement. And the final one I want to talk about, and it's quite clear, make it adaptive. You need flexibility in these arrangements. And why this is important is, if there is one thing that is certain, is that uncertainty is going to continue. And if uncertainty continues, the regulator needs flexibility in order to respond to that. And that means flexibility within the traditional rate setting period. Now, where we've seen this done well, in Great Britain, we see in RIIO-2 now an increased focus on uncertainty mechanisms, so the ability to flex within the rate setting period. We see in New Zealand, which we already discussed, targeted mechanisms in relation to innovation, specifically for DER. And we see in Australia, for the reliability incentives, progressive arrangements that flex over time and recognise that the value of reliability does not stay static. These are all great examples of how regulation is adapting. And I just want to leave you with one final thought. As we said before, optimal regulatory framework will vary. There is not a one-size-fits-all, but there are certain questions that you can ask, regulators can ask, and utilities can ask to understand what might work best for their jurisdiction. For the regulator, it's about what leadership and best practice do you want replicated. It's about what should be prioritised in your particular jurisdiction. What is the priority for you? And crucially, how much change do you want and over what timescale? Is it a short, medium, or long-term goal? For the utility, how is the energy transition going to impact your network, your customers, and when? Also, how can you best engage with your customer base to understand what they need? And finally, what mechanisms may best drive what they need? And that comes back to the engagement with the regulator. So I'll stop there for today, and I'll hand you over for any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Grant and Chris and Brian. And it's remarkable the information that you're providing from literally around the world. I would just ask if each of you could come back on camera to join me at this time. A reminder: Chris was coming to us from England, Brian's coming to us from the United States, and Grant's coming to us from Scotland. And their knowledge is obviously on display here. We will now open our session up for questions, and if you'd like to do so, please just tap your question into the chat, the question panel on screens, and we'll get to those items. Gentlemen, I did make note. Wow, we heard today about customer consultation is just increasing in various locations around the world. We heard about incentives in the areas of cost effectiveness incentives, reliability incentives, innovation incentives, or these are all key items. And we certainly heard some of the key lessons, including keep it simple, be fully engaged with your stakeholders, back to that interaction with customers, and make it adaptive, because we are in challenging times. So again, if you'd like to get to a question, please do so. But just to get it kicked off, we do have some questions at this point, and I'm going to start it off. Chris, maybe we'll start with you, if that's okay. The first question that's come in is, what are the biggest challenges regulators are facing as they try to make changes to their regulatory approach?
Thanks, Dave. I mean, for me, I think the biggest challenge is really that kind of first stage in the kind of process of regulatory change, is really kind of determining, what's in scope and what are the key areas to focus on in terms of outcome metrics as well. And it's really that stage that kind of sets the scene for the rest of the work, but it requires a lot of involvement with customers and stakeholders really to determine what's most important. So it's a challenge, but also a kind of opportunity to kind of make sure the performance-based regulation focuses on the right areas.
Great, thank you very much. We are getting questions that are coming in, and encourage each of our listeners to please do so. And as that's happening, Brian, I'm going to go to you. What role is S&C playing with clients in developing or responding to new regulations?
Okay, Dave. Well, S&C is, I think most people know us as a product manufacturer, and we are that. We kind of think of ourselves as an energy reliability and resilience company, above all else, and the manufacturing of products is part of that. Our regulatory team was created to kind of support that role. We work with utilities and regulators to kind of share knowledge and talk to them and kind of share knowledge about what's going on next. Sometimes there have been circumstances where regulators say, hey, we want you to come in and actually help us with something. We want to give you a contract to do that. Or utilities have come to us and said, hey, we've had a new development, and we're in our regulation, and we're developing a rate case, and we would like your guidance on how to present this rate case in this new model. So there are some times where we will actually take a contract to support folks, but in general, our goal is to help S&C's clients any way we can.
Great, thanks very much. Next question that's come in, Grant, we'll go to you, if that's okay, on this one.
Yeah, no
in
problem.
Your presentation, Grant, you mentioned the guide S&C is preparing on the process for developing a revised regulatory framework. Can you please provide more information on this? And who is this guide for? Is it for utilities, regulators, government, all three?
Yeah, no problem, Dave. Yeah, no, absolutely. I probably have to do this in fairly shorthand because it's not there's a bit to the guide. But the things I would say is, first of all, it's a document that can be useful for utilities, it can be useful for regulators, it can be useful for government. So it can be useful across the board. What it does is it essentially works through, I think I mentioned there were 6 stages. So it really talks about the kind of challenges each stage. It talks about what you'd have to do and how you move through the process. One thing I can reveal is it's very much focused on the importance of getting it right from the start. So if you've got that kind of scoping stage, the first stage absolutely is your solid foundation, then you can build on the top of that, performance metrics, incentives, targets, etc. The guide works through best examples that we've seen of those from different jurisdictions. And then it really focuses down as well in the latter part on how you can pull that all together and how you need flexibility over time, which I talked a wee bit about in the presentation, in order to change and adapt the mechanisms as change happens in the industry. Now, the one thing I'd say is it's still a wee bit of a work in progress. We're still adding aspects to it over time, but we would be delighted to engage with utilities, with governments, with regulators on it as well to talk through our findings.
Great, thank you very much. I'll just move to our next question. And this question is coming in and saying, several years ago, a few Australian utilities requested that they abandon the IEEE Beta 2.5 major event day normal distribution methodology to adopt the Cox Box methodology to identify major event days. Has that evolved and been adopted? And if so, to what extent and impact to the utilities has occurred?
That's a very specific question, a very detailed question as well. So yeah, you're right. I mean, actually, to the questioner, the same issue, by the way, has arisen in Great Britain as well. So there have been various debates about how you deal with extreme events, how you build that into the process. My understanding is it's evolved slightly in terms of the mechanism. So they have tweaked the mechanism to try and better reflect their impact overall. But I don't think it's been fundamentally changed, because extreme events are still very much part of the process, as they are in Great Britain as well. How it evolves over time as well, I don't know. It has not played a big part, as far as I understand, in the recent reset of the process. It didn't seem to come up as a major issue then, but it is one that I say is consistently evolving, to be honest. But as I say, that's the extent of my my understanding. It's a very technical question, very specific question.
Okay, thank you. Just as a follow-on, a different question. It says, recently a Canadian jurisdiction has applied a PBR penalty to service levels based on reliability. It was considered a token penalty, and it would have worked out to over 50 cents per customer on their next utility bill. Instead of such token monetary penalties, would it not have been more beneficial to the customer to take those same funds and have them applied to undergrounding a small portion of the network, or upgrade equipment at the worst performing feeder and or other similar scenarios? So that was, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there are different approaches. I mean, in terms of whether undergrounding is the right solution is very area dependent, and you're gonna kind of have to have the data there. In terms of PBR, whether it be carrot or stick, you sort of need a blend of both. Utilities are not, this is a personal opinion, I don't think utilities are ever going to be motivated to make, or really a change in the way they're doing things based entirely on sticks, because that's not really the way they operate. They focus on how can we maximize, whether it be return to shareholders, return to the Crown, but we need to kind of maximize our operating profit, and that can only be done with the carrots. It can only be done by altering a PBR model that will say, here is how you make money. Now, I think that the sticks in this case can be very interestingly utilized, but sticks are not a good mechanism to incentivize good behavior. They're a great mechanism to disincentivize bad behavior.
Yeah.
But if you want to incentivize good behavior or desirable outcomes, the carrots tend to do much better. So I guess I'm agreeing with the question answer with the caveat that the specificity of undergrounding, that kind of depends.
Yeah, no,
Great,
I just sorry, just add where we've kind of seen PBR incentives kind of work well and kind of drive industry transformation. For example, in kind of Britain and Australia, it's typically been a mixture of rewards or carrots and sticks, as well as there being kind of funding for performance improvements. So I think the risk with kind of penalty only type regime is it kind of drives behavior of kind of maintaining the current level of performance, but it doesn't really kind of drive kind of further improvements.
Thank you. Grant, this is probably more over your direction. It's actually not a question, but it's more of a comment. It says, in Australia, part of the success of NUREG is that it is a jointly sponsored initiative, including the network, the Energy Network Association, the Australian regulatory staff, Energy Consumers Australia, and this has led to joint ownership of its success. So this is very much supporting what you were talking about in terms of, in fact, many of you were talking about in terms of the stakeholder engagement. So just a comment there. Another
that
question.
Comment is spot on, by the way, Dave, just to say that comment is absolutely spot on, because we've seen that in other jurisdictions as well, that the importance of the regulator and other parties getting behind the mechanism and supporting it. And you say that very much as a joint approach is what drives success. So I completely agree.
Great lesson there for everybody.
Sorry, Dave, not to forestall the next question, but I just wanted to add to what Grant was saying. Here in New York, the REV program, which is kind of our version here of performance-based regulation, one of the things I think that is making it successful is, one, that it's obviously not just a list of carrots and sticks. It is a reimagining of how we are doing remuneration. But more importantly, it is coupled with other things that are happening in the state at the same time. So we're not trying to solve the energy problems, whether it be the distribution system or our environmental goals or reliability goals. We're not trying to put that all on the utilities. The state is saying, well, we're going to have the utilities focus on this. We're going to complement that effort by focusing on other complementary aspects, things that state and local government are maybe more better lined up to do. And I think that holistic approach, not just regulatory, but policy hand in hand, is going to be successful.
Thank you. Next one. Are you aware of any customer consultation forums? We're talking a lot about engagement with customers and whatnot. Have there been any customer consultation forums with utility customers on applied utility penalties? If so, what are the results of those consultations, and do customers want the utility to be penalized?
It depends on who you speak to be honest, actually. I mean, you always get a range of views in any process, and there are certainly and I can say Britain as an example for this. There was a bit of a perception of RIIO-1 that it was maybe too generous in some respects. Now, as a perception, and as a result, they were looking for maybe more in terms of, some parties were looking for more in terms of penalisation. So you can get some of the consumer bodies and others who are representing consumer groups that, yes, very much were pushing for more downside, if you like, as opposed to just upside. But I think it goes back to the earlier point that Brian made as well. I mean, it is getting the balance right. And I mean, no regulator goes out of its way to be overly generous or overly overly harsh. You're trying to get that balance right, and it's particularly important in a world if you're trying to encourage the energy transition, getting that balance right so investment continues in the right areas, but in a way that's affordable for consumers. It is no easy task.
Right, thank you. And just given the time, this would be our final question at this point. And the question is, from a RIIO perspective, how do cloud-based or OM&A expense solutions fit into the traditional capital-driven regulatory environment?
Well, I can speak to that. I mean, one of the key changes under RIIO was really to remove the kind of distinction between operating and capital expenditure. So, companies under Ofgem, what it calls the total expenditure approach, can earn a return on operating cost type solutions as well as on capital investment spend. So we have actually seen a kind of response to that in a number of ways. And the example of sort of cloud-based solutions is a good one. We've seen utilities kind of move increasingly in that direction, but it's also changed the balance between kind of asset replacement and spending on kind of maintaining and refurbishing assets as well. So that's definitely been one of the advantages of the total expenditure incentives.
Great. Well, thank you. We are approaching the top of the hour, so we'll draw our time together to conclusion. So with that, we'd like to certainly thank S&C Electric and the expertise that each of you, Chris and Brian and Grant, are providing to our audience today. So to our viewers, we'd like to ask you to please mark your calendars. Our next conversation series webinars will be held on September the 8th. Opus One will be speaking how non-wires alternatives help Nova Scotia Power weather the worst of Hurricane Dorian. And on September the 10th, Hatch Limited will be speaking to electrical distribution grid continuity given COVID. If you haven't yet registered, you can do so by going to CEA's website, electricity.ca. In closing, I'd like to again thank each of Chris and Brian and Grant and each of you today for joining us. This concludes today's conversation webinar, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye for now.